Hello everyone and welcome to Azam Sharp Weekly. In this video, we are going to get started with building our weather application in SwiftUI. This is a multi-part videos, so there will be some future videos I will be creating to extend the functionality of the weather app. But in this video, we're just focused on consuming an API from OpenWeatherMap and displaying it on the screen. That's it. As I said before, we will be using OpenWeatherMap. So the first thing you need to do is you need to sign up for the OpenWeatherMap. Once you are signed up, you can go to the API tag and current weather application or a current weather data. In the current weather data, you will find many different kind of routes or endpoints, API endpoints that you can use. In order to invoke any of these endpoints, you must pass in the API key. And the API key you can only get if you go ahead and sign up for OpenWeatherMap for free. So you're going to get the key in the email, and then you can use the key, just paste the key right over here, and you will get the information, some sort of a JSON result. One of those JSON results looks something like this. You can see in the URL that I am passing the name of the city, which is Q equals to Houston. The second part that you need to pass in is the app ID. So over here, you will pass in the API key. So make sure you again sign up for the OpenWeatherMap so that you can get your API key. This is the result that comes back. This is the live data. We're mainly interested in the main portion, which is this portion. You can see the temperature is 306. All the temperature by default is in Kelvin, so that you can change it to Fahrenheit or Celsius depending on your needs. But right now we're just going to display Fahrenheit. That's perfectly fine for us. Later on you'll see that we will be able to customize it. We can say that, oh, we want to simply use the Fahrenheit. We want to use Celsius. That's perfectly fine. Right now Kelvin is okay. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we need to do is we need to create some sort of a model. Not the business domain model, but a model to represent this data. And not even all of this data, because this contains a lot of other stuff that we have no interest in. The only thing that I actually want is this part, because it does contain the temperature and the humidity, two of the things that are important to me. So let's go ahead and design some sort of a model. I'm going to go ahead and add a new folder, and I will call it models. Inside the models, I'm going to go ahead and add a Swift file to represent my model, and I will call this weather response. Now, there are multiple things to note over here. The result that you are getting starts with the top level dictionary or the object that is being sent. And inside that object, you have another property, which is main, which contains the things that you actually need. So I'm going to structure it in a very similar way. I'm going to create the top level object or structure, which will be weather response. Inside there will be another object, which will be called weather, which will consist of all these properties, or mainly temperature and humidity. So let's go ahead and say structure weather response. Now, since this is coming across the wire or coming from across the wire, we have to mark this as decodable or codable if you want to encode it later on. We don't really want to do that, so I'm just marking this with decodable. And one of those properties will be main. So let's go ahead and create the main property so that it can map correctly. And the main property will be weather. Now, there is no such thing as weather, and we can also make this a let. So now let's go ahead and make a struct called weather. The weather struct should also be decodable, and the weather struct would represent everything in the main portion of the JSON response. So all of this stuff. So I can go ahead and say temperature and humidity. So I'm going to go ahead over here. I'm going to say temperature, which will be, let's go ahead and check it out. Looks like some sort of a double value. So double. and humidity, which I'll also say double. All right. And it looks like it is conforming to decodable. Now, this looks perfectly fine now. We are on purpose creating the same exact property names, temp, temp, and humidity, as they are reflected over here, temp and humidity. If you want to use some different property names, then you will have to use the coding keys, and you can search on coding keys how to map the correct properties to the JSON response. That's a different story, but right now we're just going to keep it simple. Okay, the next part that we want to do is we want to write a service which is going to go to the URL and going to get all that information. So I'm going to go ahead and add a Swift file, and I will call this weather service. Okay, let's go ahead and get started with weather service. I'm just going to call this weather service. And the whole point of weather service is to fetch the weather. So I will go ahead and say over here, get weather. We're not really passing in anything over here. We're just going to pass in kind of like the completion handler. We are going to make it escaping because we will be assigning it later on. And over here, we can use the Swift for result type. So I'm just going to go ahead and say result. And the result that we are expecting will be of weather because we're just asking for the weather. The weather can also be null maybe, so we can go ahead and make it optional. And the other part is the network error or the failure. What happens when it actually fails? So we're just going to say network error. Network error is nothing more than an enum that we are going to get created, network error, which is using error. And I can say over here, let's say bad URL. We can say no data. We can also have a case for decoding error and so on. Okay, so inside the get weather, we need to get the URL. So this URL right here. Let's go ahead and put it right here. I'm going to put the URL in a different file because I want to use the API key and I don't want to like make it invisible all the time. So I'm going to go ahead and add something called an extensions folder. And I'm going to go ahead and add a new file right here. And I will call this URL plus extensions. This is a good practice because now all of our URLs will be in the same place. So this will be a URL. And now we have all of this in the same place. So I can go ahead and say maybe static function URL for weather. That's fine, I guess. And we are not really passing anything, I believe. And we are going to get returned with a URL. And now I can go over here, I can say guard, let URL equals to URL, passing in the URL as a string, which is with the API key, the correct API key, by the way. And if it doesn't work, then, well, we can go ahead and I guess return nothing over here. And or else we can go ahead and return something like this. Okay. Now, I'm going to replace this your API key with the actual API key, but when you download all of this code, you are still going to see your API key, which means you have to put your own API key. Let's go back over to our weather service. And now I can go ahead and get the URL. So URL equals to, and URL dot URL for weather. Else, well, else we can actually throw some sort of a completion handler. And we can go ahead and say failure with the bad URL. So that's the first task that we have, and make sure that we return it. If the URL is not bad, then we can go ahead and perform URL session.shared.data task with the URL, passing in the URL, and we're going to get the completion handler back, which is going to be data, which is going to be a response and some sort of an error. Make sure you call resume. If you don't call resume, nothing is going to happen. Again, we can go ahead and unwrap our data equals to data where the error is equals to nil. else if it is not nil, then, well, something bad has most probably happened. So we can go ahead and call completion with a failure of no data. If, however, data was successful, then we can go ahead and decode it. So JSON decoder, and once again, we will have to say return. JSON decoder dot decode, and the decoding is the topmost element, which is weather response dot self. Self basically means that there's a type that we are decoding, and we are going to get a weather response. Now, weather response will be an optional, so we can go ahead and unwrap this, or we can simply get the value out of there. So we can just say weather response equals to weather response. So the unwrapped version will be now living inside this variable, weather response. Make sure that you're using if let. Once it is decoded correctly, meaning that it is optional and everything is working fine, we can go ahead and fire completion handler again, and with this time success, and passing in the weather response dot main, which is the weather. Else, if the decoding actually fails, then we can also again call completion handler, and in this case we can say failure and passing in the decoding error because something failed to decode. So this is it. This is our weather service, which is responsible for fetching the weather. Great. Now the next part is we need to implement our view models. This is a model. This should not be communicating anything on the screen. A view model is something that will be communicating on the screen. So we should get the view model to work. I'm going to go ahead and add a new group, and I will call that group view models. And inside that group, I'm going to go ahead and add a brand new file. And that will be a Swift file. That's perfectly fine. I will call it weather view model. And let's go ahead and start. Weather view model, which will be observable object. And you'll see in a moment that why it is an observable object. In order to work with the view model, we need a couple of different things, right? What we want to do is we want to make sure that we can create a request that can go and give us the actual weather. So we need that function first of all, right? So I can go ahead and say fetch weather. So that's the first thing we need, a function that will be able to fetch the weather. And this can actually go ahead and use the weather service that we created. So weather service dot get weather, and it is going to give us the weather. We are going to use trailing closure over here. So I'm going to go and say result in, and we can perform a switch on the result. So switching the result. And for the case where it is success, we will actually get the weather. So let's go ahead and say weather. Great. The other case, let's go ahead and just say print over here something like success, so that it at least compiles correctly. Failure, we are going to get the error, and we are going to go ahead and say error, so that it just builds correctly. Now we're not really using the weather, we're not really using the error, but it at least is able to provide us with those information. Now once it fetches the weather, once you're done fetching the weather, we can go ahead and put it into some sort of a variable. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a variable called weather, and this will be of type weather. Great. So we have weather variable, and now we are getting the weather, which is right here. Once we get the weather, we can simply assign the weather. So weather equals to weather. There we go. And for the print statement or for the error, we can just let it go. We can even go ahead and kind of like remove this part because we are not interested anyways. So we can kind of remove this, that we're not really doing anything when it is an error. So now we have the weather information hopefully fetched. But we still need to expose some properties on our weather view model so that it can provide the data to the view. So I'm going to go ahead and expose a couple of different properties. The first property I'm going to expose will be the temperature. And it is completely in my control whatever property name I want to use, and also the type. And then we can say weather dot and then the actual name of the temperature, which is this. Now over here you can see that the temperature, in this case we have to make sure that we are unwrapping this correctly, because if we are not unwrapping this correctly, or if the weather is actually not loaded, then it will be a problem. The other thing that we have to make sure is that we have loaded the actual weather information. So there are a couple of ways to do that. The first thing is that we can always check for the loading state. Now we don't really have any way to perform the loading state, but we can always check for the loading state, that if the weather has been loaded correctly or if it's not loaded correctly. All right, so forgetting about the loading state, what we're going to do is we're going to say weather.temperature, but since the temperature is going to come out as double of optional, we have to unwrap it somehow. So I'm just going to say temperature, else if everything fails, we have to still return something. So I'm just going to say 0 or something, and then return the temperature. All right, so this is at least going to allow us to return the temperature. Okay, now let's go to the content view, which is our main application, main view, and we are going to go ahead and create a private var, which will be our weather view model equals to weather view model. So let's go ahead and say weather view model. And this will be an observed object. So we are observing the changes from this object. Now, if you check out the weather view model, we want to notify the view or any other that the weather has been received by us. So we have to make sure that we are marking this with published. If you don't mark this with published, then you are never going to get notification of the new weather has arrived. And also, whenever you are setting a value of a published property, make sure that you are doing it on the main thread, or else the Swift compiler is going to tell you that, hey, you got to do it on the main thread. Okay, let's go back to our content view. And now it's time to find out that at what point in time should we be getting all this information, meaning the weather actually. So you can perform it on appear. So I'm just going to say on appear. And on appear is fired whenever the view actually appears. So now I can say self.weatherVM dot fetch weather. So when the view appears, go ahead and call weather fetch weather, and you will get the value. Now over here, I'm going to go ahead and display the value. So one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that initially it might display the 0 value or something. So weatherVM dot, and if I say temperature, the temperature, the initial value that we have provided is 0 or something, right? So it might end up displaying 0. So that's why I was talking about the loading state. That was definitely going to help us out. Let's go ahead and build this again. So you might say 0, which is wrong, which is not a good idea to show 0, obviously, right? But now we have something being displayed. And now let's go ahead and run this, keeping in mind that I have already updated the API key. Before we run this, one more thing we can add is the transport security. So in info.plist, go ahead and add the NS app transport security. And in there, we are simply going to say that we can allow arbitrary loads right now. We're just going to say yes. Okay. In the actual application, you can specify that which website you are whitelisting so that the data can be fetched from there. But right now, we're just creating a very dummy application, so that's perfectly fine for now. Let's go ahead and run this again and see if we are at least able to fetch some data. And there we go. We were able to fetch data in Kelvin because by default it is Kelvin, and we were able to display it. So this is good, and this is all using MVVM design pattern. We created the view model, which is the weather view model. We created the weather service, and we also created our weather response, which is our model. So we were able to do all of those different things. Now, obviously, this is a very simple example. Right now, everything is hard-coded to use Houston, and the temperature is also in Kelvin. And also, when the temperature is not even loaded, we see this, which is not good. We should be able to see something different rather than passing in 000. All of those different things can be added later on, but you can see right now it is definitely working. It is definitely fetching the live data, the live information, and getting it displayed on the screen. So make sure that you check out the repository for this, and hey, make sure that you realize that you have to provide the API key. So sign up for the OpenWeatherMap free account, and you will be able to get the API key for free. In the next videos, we are going to make this a little bit better. We're going to add a text box. We have to add a loading state and things like that. And we have to also add some sort of a conversion between a Fahrenheit and a Celsius, because I don't think anybody is interested in Kelvin data. So we will be doing that in the future videos.